She thought she was buying a ruined house on a cliff. What she actually uncovered was a secret that powerful people spent decades trying to erase. Stay with us, because this story will take you where history never meant to go. By the time the sun rose over the quiet rows of identical houses in the San Diego suburb, Emily Harper had already been awake for an hour, lying still on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling where the plaster had begun to separate. The room smelled faintly of detergent and cold coffee. A thin glow crept through the blinds, outlining the modest furniture she had bought years ago, when life still felt stable and predictable. Now every object in the room seemed to carry the same quiet tension that had settled over her life. In the kitchen, unpaid bills lay stacked in uneven piles on the small table. Utility notices, medical statements, credit card reminders, and the ominous envelope from the bank that she had not yet forced herself to open. Each piece of paper felt heavier than it should have been, as though the weight of the words inside could bend the table beneath them. Emily moved through the morning on instinct, preparing a simple breakfast for her son, packing his school bag, tying his shoes, offering reassurances that sounded calm but felt hollow even as she spoke them. She had become practiced at hiding the cracks in her composure. Every quiet moment brought the same cascade of thoughts she could no longer keep at bay. The unpaid mortgage, the loan taken to cover old expenses, the steady vanishing of savings she once believed would protect them in any emergency. The sense that the floor beneath her life was slowly giving way, inch by inch, day by day. There had been a time when none of this had seemed possible. Emily had once worked as a senior accountant for a mid-sized construction firm. It was not glamorous work, but it paid reliably. The company built residential developments and small commercial projects across Southern California, and for years the flow of work had been steady. She handled payroll, budgets, tax filings, internal audits. She had been proud of her precision, of the quiet respect she earned from colleagues who trusted her calculations without question. They had owned a modest home then, paid for by 2 steady incomes. Life had felt firmly anchored. The collapse had come slowly at first, then all at once. Delayed payments from clients, contractors refusing to begin new projects without guarantees, rumors of investors pulling out, executive meetings held behind closed doors, reassurances that everything would stabilize. Then one cold Friday afternoon, the entire staff had been called into a conference room and told that the business was shutting down within weeks. Payroll would be delayed indefinitely. Severance was uncertain. The office would close by the end of the month. Her husband at the time had assured her they would manage. He spoke confidently about his next business venture, about money that would come soon, about connections that would carry them through. Weeks passed, then months. The payments stopped. The explanations grew thinner. And one day he simply vanished, leaving behind debt, unanswered messages, and documents that revealed financial obligations Emily had never known existed. Some were joint liabilities. Others had been signed in her name without her fully understanding the scope of what she had agreed to. The legal consultations she managed to afford offered little comfort. Recovering anything through the courts would take time and money she did not have. Tracking him down proved nearly impossible. The man who had promised to protect his family had dissolved into silence as completely as if he had never existed. The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Emily had recognized the logo on the envelope immediately and left it unopened at the edge of the table for hours, as if distance might soften the meaning of its contents. When she finally opened it, her hands had trembled so badly that the paper shook audibly. The notice was formal and precise. The arrears were listed clearly. A deadline was established. If the balance was not resolved within a matter of weeks, foreclosure proceedings would begin. That night she had not slept. Images of temporary shelters, cramped motel rooms, borrowed couches, and the quiet humiliation of asking for help had filled her thoughts. Worse than any of it was the idea of uprooting her son from the small world he understood and trusted. Friends, teachers, familiar routines, the stability she had promised to preserve at any cost. For days afterward, Emily moved through life in a state of controlled panic. She searched job boards compulsively, applied for positions that barely paid enough to cover groceries, let alone a mortgage. She took temporary work wherever she could find it. bookkeeping for small businesses, data entry, seasonal retail shifts. It was never enough. Each deposit into her account felt instantly consumed by the next obligation. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon when she sat in the public library, the soft hum of computers and the dry smell of old paper around her, scrolling through job listings that blurred together into a meaningless parade of rejection. She drifted aimlessly from one listing site to another until she found herself on a county property portal she had never visited before. A banner at the top announced upcoming auctions of confiscated real estate. At first, she looked out of idle curiosity with the detached skepticism of someone who assumed none of it could possibly apply to her life. Small homes in distant suburbs, empty lots in desert counties, foreclosed duplexes in neglected neighborhoods. Each one carried a starting bid that, even at its lowest, still seemed unattainable. Then, buried several pages deep among the listings, she saw something that broke the monotony. The photograph was poor, likely taken from a distance years earlier. Grainy, slightly crooked. A large villa perched on the edge of a rugged coastal cliff, the ocean stretching endlessly behind it. The description was minimal. A historic residence. As is condition. No pre-sale inspection. Buyer assumes all responsibility. A starting bid that seemed more like a clerical error than an actual number. Emily stared at the screen in disbelief. The location alone, even without knowing the condition of the structure, should have placed the property far beyond any modest investor's reach. Her first instinct was that it must be a scam, but the listing sat securely within the official county portal, stamped with procedural language that left no room for doubt about its legitimacy. She clicked on the history of the property and read through decades of sparse entries. Ownership had once been listed under a private trust. The villa had stood empty for more than half a century. Property taxes had gone unpaid for years until the county finally seized it. The name of the original owner appeared only once, almost as an afterthought in the earliest record. Lillian Crawford. The name resonated faintly in her memory. It took only a few moments of searching for Emily to realize why. Lillian Crawford had been a celebrated actress in the golden age of Hollywood, whose life had ended abruptly and controversially. A figure remembered as much for her tragic demise as for her success on screen. Official biographies framed her as unstable, overwhelmed by fame and pressure. Unofficial accounts whispered about powerful relationships, hidden struggles, and forces that had worked quietly behind the scenes. As Emily read article after article, forum post after forum post, the legend deepened. Mentions of a secret retreat by the ocean, a home she kept hidden from the public eye, a place beyond the control of studios and handlers. Most dismissed the idea as myth, a fantasy created by fans searching for meaning in a life cut short. Yet the address in the auction listing matched the general location described in those old discussions. The distance from commercial centers, the isolation, the sheer improbability of such a property appearing at such a low starting bid. That evening, after her son had fallen asleep, Emily continued researching long into the night. She calculated the average cost of land along that stretch of coastline. Even stripped of any structure, the lot alone could bring an amount that would solve nearly every problem in front of her. The logic was dangerous in its simplicity. If she could somehow acquire the property, photograph it, and resell it through legitimate channels, the margin could change everything. But the risks were staggering. The house could be structurally unsound. Legal complications could surface. Environmental restrictions might make resale impossible. The warning that no inspection was permitted before purchase echoed like a siren in her thoughts. Only the truly desperate or the deeply reckless would consider such a gamble. She realized with a hollow clarity that she was both. Over the next 3 days, Emily stripped her life down to its barest essentials. She sold what few valuables she still possessed. Old electronics, jewelry she had kept since college, extra furniture. She closed one credit account to open another with a higher interest rate. She borrowed small amounts from acquaintances who barely recognized the woman she had become. Pride dissolved under the weight of necessity. Every dollar she gathered felt like a fragile brick in a wall she was constructing against collapse. When the night before the auction arrived, she counted the cash again and again at her kitchen table until the numbers lost all meaning. She had barely reached the minimum threshold required to place an opening bid. There would be no margin, no cushion, no second attempt. The auction took place in a dull municipal building with fluorescent lighting and scuffed floors that bore the quiet authority of bureaucratic routine. A modest crowd gathered, composed mostly of seasoned investors and legal representatives. Emily felt painfully out of place among them, clutching her registered number with a mixture of dread and resolve. Lot after lot passed with mechanical efficiency. Properties changed hands with practiced gestures and calm calculation. When the villa on the coast was finally announced, the room grew strangely quiet. For a few drawn-out seconds, no one reacted. Then Emily raised her number. The bidding escalated slowly at first, almost reluctantly. One other participant entered the contest late, a presence that radiated confidence and resources far beyond her own. Each of his bids pushed the price beyond the point she had calculated as survivable. Her breath shortened. Her palms grew slick. Still, she raised her number again, driven by something far more desperate than reason. Then, at the very threshold where her funds would have failed entirely, the unexpected occurred. The competing bidder was suddenly called out of the room. The interruption lasted several minutes, stretched tight with tension. When he returned, his expression had hardened into unreadable neutrality. Without further contest, he withdrew. The final gavel fell. The villa was hers. The paperwork was swift and unforgiving. Transfer documents, liability disclosures, official warnings about structural and environmental unknowns. She signed everything without hesitation, her mind suspended between disbelief and terror. A clerk handed her a simple envelope containing the keys. Along with them came a low-voiced remark about the local reputation of the house and the odd circumstances of its abandonment. Emily drove home in silence. The relief did not bring comfort, only the crushing awareness that she had just stepped beyond the final line of caution she had left in her life. She had traded certainty, however bleak, for a future that now hung entirely on what waited behind the locked doors of a house no one had entered for generations. That night she sat alone at the table long after the world around her had gone quiet. The foreclosure notice still lay in its place among the other bills. Now, for the first time since it had arrived, it felt almost distant. The risk she had taken did not erase the danger ahead, but it transformed it into something else, a convergence point, a narrow bridge suspended between ruin and escape. By the time she rose from the table and turned off the light, one truth had solidified beyond uncertainty. The path forward, however uncertain and steep, led directly to the edge of that ocean cliff and the silent villa waiting there. The decision to return to the coast came with a strange calm that followed the storm of the auction. The panic that had driven Emily for days gave way to a focused, almost distant determination. The key rested cold and heavy in her pocket as she arranged temporary care for her son, carefully choosing her words, disguising urgency as a routine errand, refusing to let fear leak into her voice. She waited until the early morning, when traffic would be lighter and the hours ahead uninterrupted. The car she borrowed rattled softly as it pulled onto the highway. As the suburban streets gave way to open road, the familiar geometry of traffic lights and storefronts dissolved into the long, winding stretch of coastal asphalt. The ocean emerged gradually at first, a distant sheet of silver between rising cliffs, then grew larger with every mile until the horizon was nothing but water and sky. Wind swept across the road in steady invisible currents, carrying with it the scent of salt and distant kelp. With every turn of the road, the world she knew slipped further behind her. The further she drove, the quieter the landscape became. Gas stations grew sparse. Cell service faded in uneven waves. The highway narrowed as it curved along the rugged edge of the land. She felt the isolation settle in her chest with an unfamiliar weight. The quiet was not peaceful. It was anticipatory, as if the road itself was guiding her towards something that had waited far too long to be disturbed. When the navigation finally signaled that she had arrived, Emily almost missed the entrance. What remained of the driveway was little more than a narrow break in the overgrowth, hidden behind tall shrubs and tangled vines. The remnants of a weather-worn warning sign leaned dangerously toward the road, its letters long faded by sun and storm. She slowed, then turned off the highway, tires crunching over gravel and broken pavement as the world of passing cars vanished behind her. The drive upward was slow. Roots had fractured the road in multiple places, forcing her to steer carefully to avoid scraping the underside of the vehicle. Branches brushed against the windows. The incline sharpened as she ascended. And then, without warning, the trees opened into a wide, exposed clearing. The villa stood there like a forgotten monument. Time had stripped it of any pretense of grandeur, yet its size alone remained imposing. Portions of the facade were discolored by decades of wind and salt. Sections of the roof sagged slightly near the edges. Windows stared outward like darkened eyes. The ocean stretched behind it in an endless, restless expanse. Emily remained in the car for several minutes, hands resting on the steering wheel, uncertain whether she was gathering courage or simply absorbing the reality of what she had done. The wind carried the steady roar of waves striking the unseen rock face below. It felt as though the house existed in a suspended pocket of time, untouched by the urgency that ruled the rest of the world. She stepped out slowly. The air was colder here, sharper. The silence was not empty but layered, textured with wind, distant water, and the occasional cry of birds circling the cliffs. The front door loomed at the top of a short, cracked stone pathway. Its surface was thick, reinforced, its handle dulled by oxidation. The key slid into the lock with unexpected smoothness. When the door gave way, the air that spilled out carried the scent of dust, old wood, and something sweeter beneath it, faint and persistent. She crossed the threshold carefully, as if stepping into another era, the sound of her footsteps swallowed by thick layers of settling silence. The entrance opened into a broad hall with a staircase rising along the inner wall. The architecture belonged unmistakably to another century. Curved banisters, decorative molding dulled by neglect, a ceiling chandelier shrouded in dust. Every piece of furniture was draped in pale coverings that fluttered slightly with the breath of air from the door. It felt less like abandonment and more like a paused life, sealed within cloth and shadow. She explored slowly, methodically. A living room extended from the hall, dominated by a large instrument standing dormant in the corner, its surface coated in fine gray powder. Sheets lay over sofas and chairs like shrouds. Beyond it, the dining area held a long table encircled by high-backed chairs, each frozen in quiet symmetry. Place settings remained on the table beneath the cloth, as though some formal gathering had been interrupted and never resumed. Further in, the kitchen revealed the same strange stillness. Cabinets were closed. Utensils hung neatly from hooks. A single cup rested near the sink beside an empty glass bottle. It was impossible to know whether it had sat there for decades or had simply been spared by chance as all other signs of movement faded. The effect was unsettling not because the place looked ruined, but because it did not look ruined enough. Upstairs, the hallway seemed narrower, drawing her inward. Framed photographs lined sections of the wall where the wallpaper had not yet surrendered to decay. Faces smiled out from behind layers of dust. Studio poses, candid moments. A woman at different stages of her life, recognizable now to Emily not as a myth, but as someone who had once moved through these rooms in ordinary hours. The master bedroom rested at the far end of the corridor, its double doors slightly ajar. Inside, light filtered through tall windows that opened onto a wide balcony overlooking the sea. The room was larger than she expected, its scale softened by layers of fabric and furniture left undisturbed. A vanity stood against one wall, its surface littered with small objects that had once been carefully arranged. Dried remnants of cosmetics, cracked glass bottles, handwritten notes whose edges curled with age. Emily approached slowly, aware with each step that she was standing within the most private space of a life that had ended before she was born. The intimacy of it was overwhelming. The curtains stirred faintly as wind slipped through a narrow opening in the door to the balcony, carrying the distant voice of the ocean into the room. She turned her attention to the built-in wardrobe that dominated one side of the wall. The doors creaked when she opened them, revealing rows of garments preserved beneath protective coverings. She touched the edge of one gently, the fabric beneath surprisingly intact. It was then that she noticed something wrong with the structure of the wall at the very back of the wardrobe. A subtle difference in texture, a faint seam where there should have been none. Curiosity sharpened her movements. She pressed gently at different sections of the surface. Most of it resisted with the expected solidity of old construction. One narrow vertical segment responded differently, yielding almost imperceptibly beneath her palm. The sensation sent a small thrill through her chest. Her search became deliberate. She traced the seam, finding along its length a small recessed section that did not match the surrounding surface. When she applied pressure, a soft, mechanical click echoed from within the wall. Slowly, as if reluctantly, the panel shifted inward. Behind it lay darkness and a narrow descending stairway carved directly into stone. The air that rose from below was dry and cold. The stairs were narrow but carefully built, hugging the curvature of the rock as they spiraled downward. Emily activated the flashlight on her phone and took the first step with deliberate caution. The sound of her footfall seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. The further she descended, the more the air changed, carrying with it a sterile stillness, distinct from the dust and age of the rooms above. At the base of the stairway, the space opened into a chamber far larger than she expected. The walls were a blend of exposed stone and reinforced concrete. Industrial shelving lined three sides of the room, extending upward to the ceiling. Sturdy containers rested on every level, impeccably aligned. Mannequins stood between storage units, each dressed in garments wrapped in translucent protective layers. Against one wall stood rows of metal cabinets and boxes meticulously labeled by hand. This was not a forgotten cellar. It was a deliberate archive. Emily moved deeper into the room as the scope of the discovery unfolded before her. One mannequin held a gown whose craftsmanship alone radiated the weight of careful preservation. Further along, others displayed garments that carried a distinct theatrical identity, unmistakably designed for the screen rather than daily life. Everything here had been curated, cataloged, and protected from time's decay. She approached a set of filing cabinets and opened one drawer cautiously. Inside were paper folders stacked in neat rows, each marked with dates, names, and locations. Contracts, personal letters, financial records, correspondence that tied the life of an actress to a web far broader than the public narrative had ever suggested. Another cabinet revealed nearly identical organization, but its contents felt more intimate. Handwritten journals, notes filled with observations not intended for public eyes, reflections on scenes, on people, on the pressures of the world she had once moved through with constrained grace. On a separate shelf, dozens of film canisters rested in exact alignment. Some bore familiar titles. Others carried only dates and locations, marked in the deliberate handwriting she now recognized from the journals. Among them were references to meetings, to apparently private recordings that had never entered any official inventory. Emily felt the first true weight of what she was seeing settle fully into her bones. This was not merely a forgotten collection of memorabilia. This was a deliberate record, a vault of evidence shaped by someone who had not intended to vanish quietly. As she examined the labels more closely, certain names began to surface repeatedly, including figures she recognized from books and documentaries. Politicians, studio executives, industrial financiers. Their presence in these quiet, handwritten notations transformed the room from a collector's dream into something far more volatile. She spent hours in that chamber, moving from shelf to shelf with a growing sense of awe and unease. The further she looked, the clearer the intention behind the archive became. It was not designed for nostalgia. It was structured like a safeguard, a parallel record preserved beyond the reach of any institution that might seek to reshape truth for convenience. When she finally forced herself to ascend the stairs again, the sky outside had shifted subtly with the passage of time. The angle of the light had changed. The ocean had grown darker. Shadows extended long across the floors of the villa, as though the house itself were stretching after long dormancy. Emily closed the hidden panel carefully, ensuring the mechanism settled back into seamless disguise. The bedroom looked once more as it had before she disturbed it, save for the quiet transformation now taking place within her own mind. As she exited the house and returned to the clearing, a motion on the distant road caught her attention. A vehicle slowed noticeably as it passed the narrow break in the shrub line. Its dark windows reflected the fading light, but concealed whatever lay within. It paused just long enough to feel intentional before continuing on without turning toward the driveway. The moment lingered in her thoughts as she drove away. She could not say with certainty whether she had been noticed or merely imagined the significance of coincidence. Yet something in her instincts refused to dismiss it. By the time she reached the highway again, the last light of day had drained from the sky. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain. Behind her, hidden in the cliffside villa, the archive remained sealed once more, waiting in stillness. What Emily could not yet know was that the house on the cliff had already begun to wake, and with it, the forces that had once worked tirelessly to keep its secrets buried. Emily did not return to the house on the cliff for several days after her discovery. The image of the hidden stairway, the stone chamber, and the silent archive followed her into every waking moment. At night, the arrangement of mannequins and shelves drifted behind her closed eyes, not as a dream, but as a persistent afterimage, as if her mind refused to let the revelation settle quietly. The stillness of the villa had been deceptive. Whatever lay beneath it was already in motion. At first, she convinced herself that secrecy was her strongest defense. She stored the photographs she had taken in multiple encrypted locations, scattered copies across devices that would not all be in one place should something fail. Still, files felt fragile compared to the physical reality of what she had seen. A vault hidden beneath stone could not simply be reduced to pixels. It existed beyond her control now, an undeniable fact in the world. The question that haunted her most was not what she had found, but what she should do next. Selling the property had once been her only plan, a simple calculation shaped entirely by desperation. That simplicity no longer existed. The house could not be separated from its contents, and the contents were no longer merely valuable objects. They were evidence, testimony preserved in material form, and potentially the most dangerous inheritance she could have imagined acquiring. After days of searching in silence, she selected a name from among the historians and archivists she had researched late into the night. The choice was deliberate. A scholar respected for independence from corporate institutions, someone known less for spectacle than for meticulous verification. The request she sent was cautious, stripped of any dramatic framing. It described an unusual discovery and the need for professional authentication under strict confidentiality. The response arrived far sooner than she expected. The phrasing was restrained, but the undertone unmistakable. The materials she described were significant enough to warrant immediate examination. Conditions were clear. The location would remain undisclosed. Access would be limited. Documentation would be conducted under professional protocols. The meeting took place 4 days later. They worked through private rooms rented under a neutral business pretext far from the coast. The photographs Emily provided drew increasingly grave attention as the historian examined them in silence. The process unfolded without visible reaction at first, then with an intensity that manifested not in words but in stillness. The evaluation continued for hours, each image considered alongside known records, each detail aligned with reference materials carried on encrypted drives. The conclusion that followed was inevitable. The items were authentic. The archive was unprecedented. The historical significance exceeded even the most conservative estimates. The implications extended beyond the walls of museums into realms governed by power and reputation. With that confirmation came the first tremor of real danger. Within days of the verification, the tone of Emily's life shifted. It began quietly, with signs so subtle they could still be written off as coincidence. A delay in her son's school records that required further identity confirmation. A sudden hold placed on one of her bank accounts pending routine review. A voicemail left without speech, timed precisely during school pickup. Then came the first offer. The message arrived through an intermediary she had never encountered before. It was framed as a discreet investment inquiry regarding the coastal property. The proposed amount exceeded anything she had ever imagined possessing. The tone was polite, professional, almost benevolent. No reference was made to archives, vaults, or historical artifacts. It was presented as a standard real estate acquisition, motivated by future development interests. Emily declined without response. The second offer arrived less than 48 hours later. This time the sum was higher, the language more insistent, the timing more deliberate. The third offer carried no politeness at all. It arrived in the form of a formal letter delivered by private courier. Inside were documents prepared for immediate transfer of ownership and a suggested confidentiality agreement that extended beyond property to personal conduct and communications. It was not lost on her that none of these inquiries had surfaced before she sought authentication. The meaning was unmistakable. Someone already knew. From that point on, the pressure accelerated steadily. The street outside her home seemed unfamiliar. Cars lingered longer than necessary. Unknown numbers appeared on her phone with increasing frequency. Her email filled with business proposals, thinly disguised as concern for her financial well-being. Each message was more calculating than the last. Each suggested that resistance would be increasingly inconvenient. The first overt warning came not to her, but through her community. Anonymous complaints were filed with local authorities alleging code violations on her property. Child welfare inquiries arrived without explanation. Financial institutions requested additional documentation, far beyond what routine reviews required. All were legitimate enough to leave no clear signature of coordination, yet together they formed an unmistakable pattern. Emily returned once more to the villa, not in secrecy but with heightened awareness. She arrived in daylight, scanning the roadside reflexively as she turned off the highway. The dark vehicle from before was nowhere in sight, but the absence did not reassure her. Silence, she was beginning to understand, often concealed more than it revealed. Inside the house, the air felt different, not changed in any physical way she could identify, but altered in perception. Every corridor now carried the weight of consequence. The vault, once an astonishing discovery, had become a burden she could no longer deny. She descended again, this time not as an explorer, but as a custodian temporarily entrusted with something far larger than herself. With gloved hands, she opened selected containers, recording detailed images of objects and documents under controlled lighting. Each item seemed to speak not through beauty alone, but through its placement within a larger, deliberate structure. The archive had not been assembled in fear alone. It had been assembled with strategy. While returning to the upper floor, she noticed something small but unnerving. The dust patterns near one of the lesser-used doors had shifted. Where weeks of undisturbed stillness had once prevailed, faint impressions now marked the surface. Someone had been inside. The realization carried a chill far deeper than the coastal wind. That evening, she contacted an attorney specializing in asset recovery and historical property disputes. The protective layer of formal legal counsel felt thin against forces she could not yet identify, but it was necessary. The consultation confirmed what she already suspected. Ownership of the land did not guarantee uncontested rights over its contents. Estates, studios, collectors, financial institutions, and private interests could all assert claims. The complexity of the coming conflict was staggering. Even as legal strategy took shape, surveillance became harder to ignore. The dark vehicle returned, this time unmistakably present along the outer road. It appeared at intervals too consistent to be random, never close enough to attract public attention, never absent long enough to suggest coincidence. Then the offers turned into threats. An anonymous package arrived one morning while Emily was away. Inside was a single photograph printed on thin matte paper. It showed her son exiting the gates of his school. The image was distant, unremarkable in composition, yet its message was unmistakable. The accompanying note contained no words. Fear sharpened into something colder and far more dangerous than panic. It became clarity. Within that clarity, a single decision formed. Secrecy was no longer protection. It was exposure without witnesses. The archive had remained hidden for decades because isolation had served those who feared its contents. The same isolation would destroy her if she attempted to navigate the storm alone. Emily informed her attorney that she would not accept private settlement, silent sale, or concealed negotiation. The materials would be revealed publicly under verified documentation. The story would not be sold in fragments to the highest bidder. It would be released intact, with evidence authenticated beyond reasonable doubt. The preparation began immediately. Independent journalists, known for investigations into institutional misconduct, were contacted through encrypted channels. Archival experts were assembled under confidentiality agreements that recognized the magnitude of what was at stake. Preservation protocols were established to protect the most vulnerable materials from damage or seizure. Each step forward intensified the hostility in return. Smear attempts surfaced in obscure online forums. Allegations of financial misconduct were whispered into professional circles. Anonymous legal complaints arrived designed not to prevail, but to exhaust. Through it all, Emily's fear did not diminish, but it changed shape. It no longer paralyzed. It drove. She arranged for her son to stay with trusted friends away from the city. She altered daily routines. She avoided predictable patterns. The quiet rhythm of ordinary life dissolved into a constant awareness of her surroundings. Even as pressure mounted, the truth pressed harder. From deeper within the archive came records that outlined far-reaching networks of influence, concealed financial transfers, and carefully layered relationships between industries that publicly appeared disconnected. The actress who had once been dismissed as a fragile figure of glamour now emerged from her own records as a deliberate observer of a world that had assumed her blind. What had once seemed like a tragic personal decline began to reshape into something structured, purposeful, and ultimately unsustainable to those who had benefited from her silence. By the end of the week, Emily understood that the conflict had reached a point from which there would be no quiet retreat. Every silent rejection of offers only confirmed her importance to the forces watching her. The surveillance became bolder, the interference more visible. The illusion of coincidence finally collapsed completely. She stood one evening at the narrow balcony of her home, city lights trembling in the distance, wind brushing through the quiet streets below. The weight of what lay ahead had never felt heavier. Yet beneath that weight rested something immovable. She was no longer protecting only herself. She was guarding a voice that had been deliberately erased. The archive beneath the cliff was not merely the property she had acquired. It was a truth that had waited half a century for its moment of return. And that moment was no longer distant. The shift from secrecy to exposure happened with breathtaking speed. Once the decision to go public had been sealed, events began to move as if driven by a force that no one could slow. Journalists arrived from across the country, some from abroad, drawn first by whispers and then by proof that could not be ignored. Independent media organizations, accustomed to resistance from institutions, sensed immediately that this story carried both historical weight and real danger. The preparations unfolded in layers of careful coordination. Legal counsel worked continuously, drafting statements, filing preemptive protections, and preparing for the storm of challenges that would follow the moment the truth was revealed. The first public disclosure did not come in the form of a dramatic announcement, but as a meticulously documented investigative feature released simultaneously by several major outlets. The article outlined the existence of the hidden coastal property, the discovery beneath it, and the verification process conducted by independent experts. It avoided speculation, relying instead on evidence. High-resolution images of selected artifacts were published alongside technical analyses that confirmed their authenticity beyond reasonable dispute. Almost instantly, the story spread across digital platforms, appearing on screens in homes and offices around the world. Within hours, the reaction became seismic. Networks interrupted regular programming. Commentators struggled to frame the implications. Historians and archivists were called in to interpret what this discovery meant for the broader narrative that had defined the actress's life and death for generations. Public curiosity surged with a ferocity that overwhelmed every attempt to contain it. What followed was not merely interest, but scandal. As additional documents were released in controlled stages, a far more complex portrait emerged. The actress was no longer an isolated figure trapped by personal instability. The archive revealed a web of financial arrangements, personal relationships, and recorded observations that exposed the undercurrents of power operating behind the glossy surface of the entertainment industry and its political entanglements. Careers that had been built on carefully managed public images suddenly found themselves under renewed scrutiny. Private histories, long sealed, began to surface in unexpected ways. Pressure mounted quickly on Emily from every direction. Statements denying the legitimacy of her claims were issued almost immediately by representatives of powerful families and corporate entities whose names appeared within the disclosed materials. Lawyers descended in waves, filing motions intended not simply to win, but to overwhelm. Ownership disputes over the contents of the vault were launched with astonishing speed. Estates claimed inheritance rights, studios asserted intellectual property. Collectors demanded restitution based on the premise that they had unknowingly purchased misattributed artifacts decades earlier. At the same time, attempts to discredit Emily personally became systematic. Old financial records were scrutinized in search of impropriety that could be amplified into scandal. Her past employment, her marriage, Even minor disputes from earlier years were repackaged into accusations of opportunism and deception. Anonymous sources floated damaging rumors that were quietly retracted only after they had served their purpose. For a brief, harrowing period, Emily and her son were relocated to a secure location under private protection. She did not reveal where they were, even to those closest to her. The pressure had outgrown inconvenience and entered the realm of genuine threat. The dark vehicle that had once lingered near her home appeared in new places. Unfamiliar faces surfaced in crowds. Messages without return addresses arrived at law offices and newsrooms alike. Yet something unexpected unfolded alongside the hostility. The public responded with overwhelming support. What might have been dismissed as sensationalism in other circumstances instead crystallized into a broader confrontation between truth and power. The image of a woman who had once stood on the brink of financial ruin, now refusing immense private offers to protect historical truth, struck a nerve across demographics. Donations poured into legal defense funds within days. Volunteers with professional expertise offered their services without compensation. Scholars from leading institutions submitted independent statements affirming the importance of public access to the materials. Even figures within the entertainment industry, long constrained by unspoken codes of loyalty and silence, began to speak in cautious but unmistakable support. A narrative that had once existed only in fragments gained coherence as it moved into the light. Court proceedings became the central battleground. For months, disputes were argued across multiple jurisdictions, each claim intersecting with others in a dense knot of legal complexity. The estate asserted prior ownership based on historical accounting. Investors claimed contractual oversight tied to old studio agreements. Financial trusts attempted to impose retroactive custodial authority. In one decisive ruling that reshaped the entire conflict, a federal judge dismissed the broadest inheritance claim. The court recognized that the contents of the hidden vault had never been listed, transferred, or publicly acknowledged in any legally binding inventory. They had remained intentionally concealed for more than half a century. As abandoned property discovered on land lawfully acquired, their default custodianship fell to the current owner, subject to public interest considerations. The decision did not end the conflict, but it fractured its foundation. Many secondary claims collapsed under the precedent it established. Settlements replaced lawsuits. What had once been a coordinated attempt to reclaim control through litigation dissolved into isolated negotiations. Throughout it all, Emily remained resolute in a decision that had grown steadily clearer within her. She would not sell the collection for private gain. The story that had been silenced for so long would not be scattered into sealed vaults once again. With guidance from historians, legal advisors, and public interest advocates, she established a nonprofit foundation dedicated to preserving and sharing the authentic legacy of the actress whose voice had been nearly erased from history. Its mission extended beyond exhibition. It would support education, fund research, provide scholarships for underrepresented artists, and sponsor mental health initiatives for those navigating the pressures of public life. The house on the cliff became its center. Restoration began under strict architectural preservation standards. Structural engineers reinforced the portions weakened by decades of exposure. Art conservators designed climate-controlled spaces capable of protecting fragile materials for generations to come. Each room was examined not only for historical accuracy, but for the emotional narrative it conveyed. The master bedroom remained largely intact. The hidden panel was preserved as part of the architectural record. The spiral stairway was reinforced with unobtrusive safety features that did not alter its original form. The vault itself was transformed into a secure archival chamber. While the most sensitive materials were transferred to specialized facilities for long-term preservation, much of the collection remained where it had been intentionally placed, now under professional protection rather than secrecy. During the 18 months that followed, Emily's life entered a rhythm unlike anything she had known before. She oversaw restoration meetings, reviewed exhibition layouts, coordinated with international scholars, and navigated the relentless attention of media. At the same time, she reclaimed a version of stability for her son, enrolling him in a quiet school near the coast, building a daily routine that no longer revolved around survival, but around growth. The opening of the museum was held deliberately on the anniversary of the actress's death, transforming a date long defined by tragedy into one marked by restoration. Visitors lined the narrow coastal road in numbers that took organizers by surprise. Scholars, artists, students, and families waited together along the cliffside path, drawn not only by fascination with celebrity history, but by the deeper gravity of a voice reclaimed from forced silence. Inside the restored house, the transformation was profound. The rooms no longer felt suspended in abandonment, but alive with purpose. Display cases revealed garments not as relics of glamour alone, but as witnesses to a life lived under immense scrutiny. Journals were exhibited with reverent restraint, selected passages revealing intelligence, vulnerability, and strategic awareness. Photographs captured moments unseen in any studio archive: quiet laughter by the shore, concentration during script readings, solitude beneath the weight of public performance. The most powerful space remained the vault. Visitors descended the spiral staircase in silence, confronted not by spectacle but by context. The final letter was displayed beneath protective glass, its presence radiating an unsettling intimacy. Its words did not accuse with anger. They testified with clarity. The actress had known what she carried, and she had prepared for the moment when truth would no longer be containable. The museum's opening was covered internationally. What began as an extraordinary discovery matured into a cultural reckoning. Educational programs were established almost immediately. Seminars on media exploitation, power dynamics, mental health, and historical revisionism drew students from universities across the country. The Foundation's scholarships funded its first class of recipients within a year. Threats did not vanish entirely, but they lost their teeth. Visibility had proven to be the most durable shield. As years passed, the story continued to evolve. New documents surfaced through related investigations. Additional individuals came forward with testimony that reinforced the archive's credibility. Legal challenges dwindled until only a handful remained active. The most sensitive recording remained sealed by court order. Its eventual release set decades into the future to balance public interest against collateral harm. For Emily, the transformation was not measured in legal victories or institutional recognition. It was found in quiet evenings overlooking the ocean, in the familiar sound of her son working on school projects at the kitchen table, in the knowledge that fear no longer dictated the shape of their days. The house on the cliff, once a place of silence and concealment, had become a beacon of reckoning and remembrance. What had begun as a desperate attempt to escape financial collapse had led her into the core of a truth that reshaped history and redefined her own purpose. She had not set out to become a guardian of legacy. She had only sought a way to survive. Yet in choosing not to retreat from what she found, she had built something that would endure far beyond the span of her own life. The archive had waited for decades in the dark. It would never return there again. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. We have many more powerful stories ahead that will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because the truth deserves to be spread.